the topic here. In a book Slavoj Žižek describes as being, quote, not the best book of the last decade, but rather simply the book of the last decade, Alain Badiou identifies as the crucial and rapidly disappearing philosophical heritage of the 20th century, quote, the joint disappearances of man and God. According to Badiou, this double inheritance was, in its full inauguration in the 1960s, suspended between the work of Jean-Paul Sartre and Michel Foucault. In particular, between Sartre's Search for a Method, the preface to his critique of dialectical reason, and Foucault's Death of Man, a snippet from The Order of Things. In order to translate the same inheritance from the realm of philosophical theory, though, to the realm of more strictly political theory, I want tonight to replace Foucault's work with the political thought of Louis Althusser, particularly given Foucault's relative lack of interest in the organization that arguably mediated even the theoretical relationship between Sartre and Althusser, namely the Parti Communiste Français, or the PCF, Communist Party of France. I find it particularly important and interesting to look at the position Sartre and Althusser each sustained in relation to the PCF, given that the question facing the left today is the failure of the party state, at least on Badiou's reading. Of course, the meaning of that failure, as well as the means to be proposed for moving forward without abandoning Lenin, remains very much in question. I have no answers myself. You guys are better at that than I, being much more the student than on these kinds of questions. Indeed, in large part, what drives my interest in precisely the entanglement of Sartre and Althusser is my bafflement about where Marxist theory should go next on the question of the party state. The very manner in which I frame the questions here should, however, make clear my commitment to the work of Alain Badiou. I trust for the most part his diagnoses. I read with careful attention his proposals about where we should focus our practical work, and I'm absolutely bowled over by his strictly philosophical work. In many ways, the most consistent driving force behind my interest in the thinkers whose histories I'll be recounting tonight is the fact that Badiou has identified them as being two of his three intellectual masters, Jacques Lacan being the third. If Badiou has produced literally whole volumes on his relationship to Lacan, however, he has said relatively little about his relationships to Sartre and Althusser. So I hope here to begin to make sense of those relationships, and so to make sense of some kind of sense of the historical importance of these two figures, political tasks, theoretically speaking. So, the setting. It should be recognized that Marxism was something of a latecomer to France, though the very possibility of Marxist political theory was arguably established by the French Revolution, and though its contours were defined at every point by the ebb and flow of the 19th century workers' movement in France, a movement that came to its culmination, of course, as well as its tragical break. Wow, one of these pages got completely out of place. What happens when the kids play with the printer? As well as its tragic conclusion with the Paris Commune. Marxism as such had little purchase in France until after 1917. After that, however, things moved rather quickly in France, the PCF being established in 1920. Of course, the Marxism that was imported into France in the immediate aftermath of World War I was inevitably the Marxism of Friedrich Engels, mediated via Lenin. Marxism that had its aim had the aim of establishing itself as a science, heavily scientific orientation. The role of Marxism changed drastically in the 1930s in France when Alexandre Kojève gave his famous lecture series on Hegel, attended by many subsequently crucial Marxist intellectuals, and when Jean-Luc Baudry began to publish his studies of Hegel, studies that are still definitive in France. With the accompanying increase in interest in the relationship between Hegel and Marx, and especially with the translation of Marx's Paris manuscripts of 1844, those were translated into French for the first time in 1937, a distinctively French Marxism was born. Though this French Marxism was moving in less than strictly Engels-esque directions, it was closely associated with the PCF into the 1940s. The 1950s and especially the 1960s, however, saw three crucial events that strongly complicated the relative unity of the French left. Without question, these events punctuated the political theoretical work of both Sartre and Althusser. The events in question were probably obvious. One, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, during which Khrushchev announced the program of de-Stalinization, justified with a list of Stalin's crimes. Two, Mao Zedong's definitive break with Russian communism and consequent invention of a rival communist theory. And three, the complex events that went into the makeup of French May '68. Issuing from these three ruptures in the continuity of communist history was an imperative to which both Sartre and Althusser gave their full attention: the need to assess the status of the so-called scientism of Marxist thought at the time. I'll take Sartre and Althusser in turn on this question. So first, Sartre. Sartre's radically individualist philosophy, first fully formulated in his famous Being and Nothingness, at first left little room for genuine political activity. Having planned on being a writer and nothing but a writer from the time he was 9 years old, Sartre more or less defined himself by being almost violently his own person. Though Being in Nothingness would not be published until 1943, and thus after he had returned from his capture by the Germans during World War II, he would later claim that it was during his stay in the prison camp that he first gained a sense for communal existence and developed an interest in communist politics. His brief attempt to engage in the resistance, complete failure really, resulted in his formation of a group with the title Socialism and Freedom, but its rapid disbanding was symptomatic of Sartre's early relative political inactivity. Indeed, Samuel Beckett said of Sartre's attempt to involve himself in the resistance, quote, "There were always those whom no one took seriously, neither the resistors nor the Gestapo. Sartre seemed to many people to be among those." Things changed during the remainder of the 1940s, during which Sartre became one of the major Marxist alternatives, quote unquote, to association with the PCF. Facing constant heavy criticism from the official organs of the PCF, Sartre effectively attempted to formulate single-handedly a Marxist theory that was fully consonant with his own thoroughly individualist philosophy. By the first years of the 1950s, it had become obvious that this project was not entirely feasible, and Sartre, quote, allied himself unconditionally with the PCF, quoting Hirsch, I can't remember his first name, though he did so without officially joining. Importantly, he called himself a fellow traveler. Importantly, during his years of association with the party, Sartre visited both the USSR and China, meeting briefly with Chairman Mao during the latter visit. He would later visit Cuba, met with Che Guevara, as well as with Fidel Castro. Famously describing himself as a fellow traveler with the party during these years, Sartre still more famously announced decisively during the same time that an anti-communist is a rat. Sartre's fellow traveling, however, would not last long. When the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956, he broke absolutely and without any reservation at all, quoting his autobiography, with the PCF over the question, declaring not only that horror was ruling the roost in Russia, but that every gesture of the PCF was, quote, the culmination of 30 years of lies and stagnation. So it was that Sartre himself called for the invention of a new left. He coined the term in France. The years from 1956 to 1960 were crucial for Sartre's theoretical development. During these years, he took as his consistent crusade to mobilize against French imperialist control of Algeria, activism that resulted in his apartment twice being bombed, the second of these resulting in the loss of a large number of Sartre's manuscripts and writings, in fact, though no one was hurt in either bomb. During the same years, Sartre was hard at work on what would become his most important work of political theory, the Critique of Dialectical Reason, published hard on the heels of his search for a method, an essay that was included as the introduction to the critique, but appeared first in Tonquin. Here Sartre at last with the critique fully broke with, or at least heavily modified his previous individualism. The book is a massive analysis of collective experience, and arguably one of the more crucial texts in Marxist political theory to come out of the second half of the 20th century. Here was Sartre's most careful and systematic critique of the scientism that had dominated Stalinism. Where he had before focused primarily on replacing such scientism with his own curious humanism, he now saw his task as one of a careful critique of Stalinist scientism in terms of his own now carefully critiqued humanism. In short, while Sartre's philosophy both before and after 1960 can in many ways be summed up as a humanism intent on placing man in the empty place left behind by the death of God, 1960 saw a shift from Sartre's definition of man in terms of the individual to Sartre's definition of man in terms of the collective, the latter particularly in terms of the masses. After publishing the critique, Sartre focused his efforts more consistently on his political activities, particularly on his campaign against the French relationship to Algeria. I go a little too nicely. I didn't edit this. It is difficult to see how his political activities during the rest of the 1960s were connected with his theory as outlined in the critique, however. In a kind of variant of, but ultimately quite distinct from, Mao's trust in the masses, Sartre had in his theory assigned the most crucial political activity to the collective masses, differing from Mao in that the latter understood trust in the masses to be a question of history rather than of politics. But Sartre's political activity seemed to have little to do with mobilizing the masses and more to do with direct, specific campaigns, more or less single-handed. Or so it was at least until May of 1968. Given what he had written in the critique, it was no surprise that he was the first intellectual to come forward in support of the students in revolt. But Sartre was also one of the first to recognize the failures of the student movement, and he quickly found his way into definitively Maoist circles, apparently silently adjusting the evaluation, his evaluation of the masses to conform more directly to Mao's theory. The 1970s thus saw him moving in Maoist circles and continuing in a variety of political activities, though less in the limelight than before. But what in all of this remains of importance today? Certainly the trajectory through which Sartre passed from a radical individualism to a thorough embrace of the collective nature of political activity remains important, particularly in an era such as our own, where a kind of watered-down pre-1960s Sartrean existentialism has become a reigning ideology. Moreover, there is unquestionably something very right about Sartre's consistent focus on freedom, even though this question must be divorced from the classically Cartesian subject Sartre couldn't shake. And of course, there is something in Sartre's radical attempt to critique Stalinism that captured the spirit of the times, and that remains an important task for the left, though crucially Sartre's way of criticizing Stalinism was, as I think Althusser above all makes clear, ultimately misguided. But what especially makes the work of reclaiming Sartre today absolutely crucial is the series of tragic details that surrounded the philosopher's demise in more than one sense. After he went completely blind, Sartre, in what would become perhaps the worst move of his philosophical and political career, hired a figure who had been a young Maoist as his secretary. This young Maoist, Bernard-Henri Lévy, would, even before Sartre died, become the leading figure of the Nouveau Philosophe, the new philosophers. Those remarkably popular philosophers who always wear unbuttoned shirts and so on, who made a career during the 1980s out of denouncing every form of Marxism as totalitarian. If you don't know anything about Bernard-Henri Lévy, he's kind of the laughingstock of French philosophy right now, thanks to his publishing a book on Kant being insane, and citing a source that was actually a parody, and not knowing it. Cutting corners doesn't pay off. Unfortunately, Lévy played something of the ventriloquist with Sartre during the latter's last years. Still more unfortunately, Nicolas Sarkozy has played something of the ventriloquist with Lévy in the last few years, continuing to pound nails into the coffin of what was once a vibrant French Marxist philosophy. To reclaim Sartre from a French philosophical tradition that would make of him a tool in support of today's capital parliamentarianism is a crucial task of history. Lévy more or less made Sartre into a protege or something during his last years, much to most of Sartre's friends' concern. So if I now turn to Althusser and leave Sartre behind, I don't actually want to leave Sartre behind. What I hope to show in the following discussion of Althusser is precisely what it was that was right about Sartre's intervention in political theory, as well as what was very wrong about his intervention. And in particular, I would like to make a few suggestions about how the rightness and wrongness of that intervention can be formulated in terms precisely of Sartre's relationship to the PCF, something perhaps only visible in the light shed on the question by an investigation of Althusser. So now turning to Althusser. Althusser was in obvious agreement with everyone else, or at least apparently everyone else, that Khrushchev's revelations called for a revision of Stalinism, but he was far less scandalized by them than most in the French left at the time. Indeed, he saw most of the rhetoric of de-Stalinization as overblown and excessive, rather than suggesting, like Sartre, that the task of Marxism in the 1950s and 60s was that of replacing the Engelsian emphasis on science with a robustly Marxist humanism. Althusser took the task of Marxist philosophers to be to recognize that Stalin's Marxism was not scientific enough. In the place of a disavowal of the scientism of established Marxism, Althusser proposed a deepening or even a radicalization of that scientism. This deepening or radicalization he proposed to undertake through a systematic structuralization of Marxist thought, meaning borrowing on the tradition of structuralism. Structuralism had been gaining an intellectual popularity for several decades before Althusser took up the task of applying it to Marxism, finding its French beginnings in the field of linguistics with Ferdinand de Saussure, but receiving its most widely influential formulations in sociology through the work of Emile Durkheim, and anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who finally just died a few months ago. Structuralism was being regarded as the most advanced and most thoroughly scientific approach to the social sciences that had come along. The most common interpretation of even Jacques Lacan's work, now as much as then, takes him to have been structuralizing psychology in the same way that others were structuralizing sociology and anthropology. Of course, there are reasons to combat this interpretation I just mentioned. At any rate, Althusser found himself a leading Marxist intellectual precisely because he was willing to apply what was being regarded as a major development in French science to the writings of Marx. Althusser reserved very specific criticisms for the humanist tradition, particularly as that tradition was finding its way, through Sartre as well as others, into Marxism. Humanism was for him a strongly bourgeois ideology, and he proposed to construct a political theory that replaced the notion of the political subject, where that's understood in a humanist way, with the notion of the political process without subjectivity, a process to which he gave the crucial name subjectivation, a word that's obviously still of major importance in political theory. Beginning from, rather than being forced eventually to arrive at, the identification of politics with collective action, Althusser thus quickly became a major Marxist intellectual, particularly with the publication of For Marx and Reading Capital in 1965. Importantly, Althusser was, during this whole period of time, an official member of the PCF. His association with the party was not without conflict, however. Interestingly, the majority of this conflict came in 1965 and 1966, when Roger Gorody was writing Sartre-like humanist philosophy for the official organs of the PCF. Althusser's radicalized scientism was not, when he first began publishing it, reconcilable with the party line, and he found himself officially rebuked by the Central Committee. Unlike Sartre, however, Althusser did not take such rebukes or points of disagreement as reason for a break. He made a public confession of having fallen into theoreticist deviation, and of having failed to discuss the union of theory and practice. Interestingly, however, while Althusser was eager to maintain official membership in the party, over 600 of his students and followers were expelled from the PCF in 1966, many of whom would go on to form the crucial Maoist groups of the early 1970s. Althusser, however, kept silence about these events at the time. What is to be made of Althusser's unwillingness to break with the party, especially when so many of his followers went far enough in the Althusserian direction to deserve expulsion? On the one hand, it can be suggested that, as Hirsch has suggested, Althusser pursued a policy of tactical retreat in order to enhance his long-term strategic influence. If this is correct, it was a good move on Althusser's part, since Gorody, Althusser's former opponent, broke with the party in 1970 and thus granted to Althusser the position of the party's unquestioned intellectual superstar. But another interpretation is possible and perhaps to be preferred. Althusser, in accordance with his theory, believed himself to be a philosopher whose work was at a significant remove from the real work of political action. It was a sharp distinction for him. There would have been little reason for him to make any kind of official break with the PCF, an organization dedicated to mobilizing political action, not to generating political theory. Althusser saw his theoretical and strictly philosophical work as being effectively conditioned by the political work of the party, not vice versa. Of course, Althusser was heavily criticized by the masses of his followers, who were collectively expelled from the PCF in 1966. Forming a large part of the critical mass during the uprising of May 68, these followers moved further and further away from Althusser, many of them publishing official critiques of their former master during the 1970s. Of course, they're all over the map now, these are former Althusserians. Meanwhile, Althusser was reworking his own political theories rather heavily, producing in the 1970s the essays that were published under the title of Lenin and Philosophy, essays clearly marked by his newfound interest in the work of Antonio Gramsci. Increasingly during these years, Althusser retreated from the center of the Marxist intellectual scene, and when in madness he murdered his wife and spent the last years of his life in an asylum, he found that most people would rather forget that he had ever been important in the first place. Certainly once post-structuralism, in the shape given to it particularly by Foucault and Derrida, although it's arguable whether or not they're post-structuralists, but I'm going with the popularized version here. Once post-structuralism took control of the French intellectual scene, Althusser's more apparently primitive structuralism could only appear passé. Althusser's disappearance was perhaps inevitable. As with Sartre, however, there is, I think, good reason to reclaim Althusser as a crucial figure in the unfolding of 20th century Marxist thought. Althusser was remarkably unique in the 1960s as a political thinker who was willing to recoup Stalinism, and even the scientism of Stalinism, or at least was willing to recognize that Stalin could not be facilely rejected or dismissed if Marxist thought was to take its next step. The wholesale abhorrence of Stalin among figures of the French left during the 1970s, and especially the 1980s, is arguably what has led to the massive disorganization of the left in which we still flounder. Althusser's willingness to grant more to Stalin than most of his contemporaries is something that must not be overlooked, especially today, when the equation of Stalinism with totalitarianism remains the greatest obstacle in the West for making headway with what Badiou has called the beautiful word that is communism. Also crucial, however, is the manner in which Althusser's place in the history of French Marxist thought during the 1960s and 70s highlights both the strengths and the failures of Sartre's intervention. On the one hand, Althusser in particular makes clear to what extent Sartre's Marxist humanism was a mistake, and Althusser's willingness to take committed political action as a strict condition for his theoretical work forms an almost polar opposite to Sartre's stubborn adherence to his Husserlian roots. But on the other hand, Althusser allows us to see that Sartre's moment was also a crucial one. Althusser's work became passé far too quickly, unable as he was to leave an impression on the philosophers that would emerge in the first years of the 1970s as the most influential thinkers in continental philosophy. Sartre might have been, in many ways, a holdover from an earlier period, but Althusser's unapologetic embrace of what would prove to be a passing fancy for the strict structuralism of the French social sciences made him a less staid figure even than Sartre. Sartre's concern with freedom, a concern Althusser could never understand, remains central to the philosophical problems to be dealt with in politics today. So there was talk of splitting up into groups or something along those lines.
split up into groups. Should we do like 3 groups? I'll just count it off, I guess. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Let's do 1's over here, 2's over there, 3's over there.
Do I float? Am I a floating signifier here?
Depends on how good.
We're doing it live.
So floating A.
Okay. We want to just go through each group and get a question from each group, or how do we want to do this? Any suggestions, anyone?
I think we should do it exactly how we did it last time. I think whoever's most comfortable should represent each group, and then kind of summarize the main points, and then maybe direct them into a question towards you, Spencer. Good idea, bad idea?
Okay. Sure, let's do that. We'll start off with group number 1. Which is these fellows.
Well, we kind of had a question, partner ignorance, but we were curious if you could explain a little bit more the difference between like scientific Marxism associated with Stalin and I guess the humanistic version on the other hand.
Yeah, so the simplest way to make them polar opposites is in a scientific Marxism, especially as it's going to be formulated by Althusser, there's no such thing as the human subject. That's a kind of abstraction. Right? And instead, there's a process, an unfolding that can be thought about scientifically. So a science of history is what Marxism amounts to at the theoretical level. At the opposite extreme, where we've got humanism, there's a reifiable Cartesian human subject that is the subject of political action and activity, and that subject is given, exists, and so the humanity as such is what real, I guess is the way to put it. So those are the two polar opposites here. Yeah, does that?
Does that kind of mean that on the scientific end that history unfolds according to certain kind of like scientific laws almost, so there's kind of this.
Yeah, I think at times it means that in scientific versions of Marxism, but not always. Althusser's version doesn't necessarily have a sort of set of fixed laws that history is going to follow in a Hegelian sense or something, or a vulgar Hegelian sense. But is rather going. He scientificizes it by putting it in terms of structuralism, which I mean we could go into the history of structuralism and so forth. But for that, it's got the nature of structures and the way that they. Yeah, I mean there's a whole topic in and of itself. But so for him, science doesn't mean the same thing that it would mean in a Stalinist connection. So that's why he thinks Stalin is not actually scientific enough, because now we've made this advance with structuralism. We recognize what science should have been. So let's push Marxism further by finding structuralism in it. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there are going to be fixed historical laws or something like that at every point. So, that clarifies it.
Is that good for group 1?
Yep.
Okay, group 2. Greg, would you mind?
Sure.
This one?
What we discussed is the similarities between Sartre and Althusser between left and right deviationism. And left deviationism is upholding what is ostensibly a revolutionary idea above and beyond everything else, so that you actually undercut the struggle. In this case, Sartre's humanism could be an ultra-left idea because it upholds this humanism above and beyond the political struggle. But then also there's rightism, which is, or revisionism, which is you revise the principles of Marxism down to just, basically just a bourgeois ideology, and then you just do whatever is, told to you, basic political actions that don't really push revolution. And so in this case, maybe Althusser could be a right deviationist in that he didn't actively fight the corruption of the French Communist Party, right? It didn't actively denounce, the things he saw were wrong, and so it allowed the French Communist Party to further degenerate. So that was one idea that we talked about. Of course, there was the discussion, if Sartre is right, then Althusser is the right deviationist. if Althusser is right, then Sartre is the left deviationist. And then what I posed is, for the three terms, there's a missing term. And again, the Lacanian point is what's missing is always the thing that's there. So in this case of Sartre, Althusser, and the French Communist Party, the thing that's missing is the French Communist Party as a genuine communist party, as a genuine political actor. And so, one thing to think about is, as a theoretician, where Badiou would fall between Althusser and Sartre, and is there a way in which Sartre, or in which Badiou unites, or at least in a theoretical sense calls for something that could account for both Althusser and Sartre, rendering them left and right deviations of Badiou. The Badiou thing was mine.
Yeah, I think so. Let me respond to the first part of that, and then to this question about Badiou. So yeah, I think that's an apt description of it, the right and left deviation for Althusser and for Sartre first and then Althusser. In fact, I think it's quite apt. In some ways, they're almost flip-floppable too, though, right? Sartre's both Sartre and Althusser are doing a kind of revisionism, saying how can we update this and bring this into something more like intellectually satisfiable or something like that, and so on. So they could be flip-flop, but I do think that's an apt description. In terms of what Badiou has done, I think one of the reasons that Badiou is willing to claim both Sartre and Althusser as two of his masters, when there are so many other people, and why is it Mao on the list, right? Is it just because he didn't live in France, or what? But it's interesting that it's Sartre and Althusser and Lacan. But I think that's because he does see himself finding the crucial kernel in each of these and drawing it. For Badiou, the question of freedom remains central, which is pretty unique, really. Freedom and the notion of the subject. He agrees with Althusser that we can't have any kind of Cartesian notion of the subject, but of course Badiou is heavily committed to constructing a theory of the subject. So he's going to break with Sartre's obvious Husserlian phenomenological orientation there, but he still does agree, let's try to sort out what a subject is. At the same time, he's clearly traces his roots to Althusser's notion of conditioning, the conditions for philosophy and theory generally, as well as Althusser clearly develops this idea that there's politics, there's philosophy, there's science, there are these different, he wouldn't have called them truth procedures, but Badiou, it's the same idea. Badiou's clearly drawing that from here. So I think Badiou does really try to say, yeah, this goes off in this direction too much, this goes off in this direction too much. I just wish Badiou would actually say something about it instead of just saying, Sartre and Althusser are two of my masters. But yeah, so I do think Badiou is doing exactly something like that.
Group number 3.
Chris, do you have any questions coming in from our group?
We mostly just talked about Althusser, and I guess Max's question, if everyone else wants to answer, was sort of who's picking up Althusser's work, this sort of trying to secure more scientific Stalinism, right? That Stalinism wasn't scientific enough. If everybody's sort of pushing Althusser in that direction.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of anyone who's doing that, especially who's trying to push Althusser's work a step further, so to speak, in the same sense that Althusser saw himself pushing Stalin's work a step further. What's that? So, I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say Badiou is the next step, but Badiou does that by delineating a very sharp distinction between science and politics. But it would be something like Althusser in that he's saying politics is a truth procedure, just as science is a separate truth procedure and so forth. But I don't think that's quite what you were after. You were going to say something.
Oh, just a side note on this matter, I believe it's the introduction to the sublime object of ideology. What Zizek points out is that the disappearance of Althusser is a political disappearance, a willful political disappearance by the French intellectuals, because he saw the debate raging at the time, he writes it in the late 80s, I believe, between Foucauldian individualism, right, of a sort of Renaissance man, a self-mastery and then the not Husserlian, it starts with an H,
Oh.
Habermasian discussion of the collective political, were both attempts to subvert and hide the Althuserian question of revolution as scientific process. So just going off like
Yeah.
as more Althusser context.
So, Max, you've got the task of being the next person to further the Althuserian project.
Are there any follow-up questions from anybody?
Well, real quick, I'm just curious, like I should know this, but I've never really talked to you much before, Joe, but I'm curious what your own kind of political orientation is, if you have one.
Learning. Yeah, Marx and Lenin, certainly. Not sure where I'm at with Mao yet. Still studying. Yeah, still learning. Still the same. But, yeah.
If there's no one else, let's give Joe a hand.